starting with security. Negotiations between Israel and Hamas terrorists in Gaza on the rocks. Gaza terror groups responding with increasing threats of escalations, particularly as agreements on the transfer of Qatari aid still undecided. In fact, Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists in the Gaza Strip are saying that an explosion and escalation are inevitable should the status quo persist. And this just days after the terror group broke the months of relative quiet with a pair of rockets aimed at southern Israeli civilians. Tensions are not just rising along the Gaza border, though. Jerusalem again becoming a flashpoint with an alleged Jewish mob viciously attacking an Arab man by the Machane Yehuda market. The 19-year-old victim now in stable condition but was admitted to Shaare Tzedek Medical Center with serious injuries, and police are investigating the incident as a terror attack. The last reported incident like this occurring in May around the height of the conflict with Hamas. ILTV condemns all forms of violence. Now, in any case, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett meeting with Egyptian Intelligence Minister Abbas Kamel in Jerusalem, the two discussing diplomatic, economic, and security-related issues between Israel and Egypt. And Bennett likewise invited for an official visit to Cairo to speak with President Sisi within the next few weeks. This would be the first official visit to Cairo by a sitting Israeli prime minister since 2011. The last unofficial visit reportedly being by former Prime Minister Netanyahu, who took a secret trip in 2018. Now, in other news, from Cairo to D.C., Prime Minister Bennett setting a date to fly to Washington as well, where he'll meet with President Joe Biden for the first time since their respective administrations began. And they'll have plenty to discuss between Iran, Hamas negotiations, and of course the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Confirmed for Thursday, August 26th, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and U.S. President Joe Biden scheduled to meet at the White House. Bennett set to take off from Israel on Tuesday, the 24th. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki saying that the visit will, quote, strengthen the enduring partnerships between the U.S. and Israel, reflect the deep ties between their governments and people, and underscore the U.S.'s unwavering commitment to Israel's security. The whirlwind visit not likely to last more than 48 hours, though, due to coronavirus precautions, and the time spent on very serious issues. First, coming off of talks in Cairo, Bennett and Biden set to discuss both security and peace talks with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Then likewise, with respect to Iran, Bennett saying that the two leaders have already completed a process of formulating a coordinated approach.
תפיסה של שותפות, תפיסה שיעדה לבלום את הפעילות האזורית השלילית של איראן, של אי היציבות, של פגיעה בזכויות אדם, של טרור, ומניעת התקרבות של איראן
The currently dicier topic, then, being the consequences of the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan. The Biden administration facing significant criticisms over the way it withdrew its U.S. armed forces, particularly from foreign allies who are now increasingly saying that the United States has lost credibility both to make demands and promises, and especially in the Middle East.
ما حدث في أفغانستان يعزز قناعة العديد من الأنظمة السياسية العربية بأن الدور الأمريكي في العالم العربي والإسلامي بين هلالين في تراجع.
الفيديوهات وهاي على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي وغيره كنت بتعاطف كبير معاهم لأن أنا كنت مريت بهاي الحالة قبل ومدينتي كلها كنت مرت بهاي الحالة وأيضا يعني اكتشفتوا إنه هاي الدنيا ما بيها أمان. يعني ممكن بأي لحظة غدا بعد غدا يصير بينا نحن نفس الشيء بعد ما أو ممكن بأي بقعة من العالم.
J'ai un message pour NATO, j'ai un message pour Biden, j'ai un message pour lui qui allez, Taliban ça change rien, Taliban ça change rien, il n'y a pas le différent, il n'y a pas le différent entre Taliban et Al-Qaïda, il n'y a pas le différent entre Taliban et ISIS et Daesh. Aujourd'hui, Taliban c'est notre problème en Afghanistan, mais l'année prochaine peut-être c'est un problème en États-Unis, en Amérique. N'oubliez pas l'Afghanistan s'il vous plaît, n'oubliez pas. Taliban ça change rien, ça change rien.
الحكم الإسلامي السياسي دايما بيكون فيه مشكلة، دايما بيبقى وراه إرهاب ودايما بيبقى وراه دم ودايما بيبقى وراه مشاكل، فطبعا احنا يعني نتمنى ان الاوضاع هناك تتحسن يعني هم اخواتنا برضه مسلمين زينا.
اعتصر قلبي ألما على الشيء اللي شفته أني. تذكرت اللي راح يعانيه الشعب الأفغاني من نساء وأطفال في ظل الطالبان، وظل أفكارهم، وظل قيودهم، وظل عقيدتهم التي يؤمنون بها والتي يريدون أن يفرضونها على الشعب بعد ما كان في ظل حكومة شرعية تماما.
يعني هذه النتيجة ستعزز أيضا من شعور الدول العربية والأنظمة العربية بأهمية إيجاد تحالفات جديدة.
So what does the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan mean for the world? And has the United States truly lost its sway in international forums, particularly with the Arab world? Joining us with more insight is founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thank you so much for being with us.
Sure.
So yeah, what are the lessons that the Middle East, that Israel, the Arab world can learn from this withdrawal from Afghanistan, and more specifically, how the withdrawal happened?
Well, some have said that the way America and the fact that America withdrew from Afghanistan is a red light for both Taiwan and Israel. And there is truth to that, but I don't think America's relationship with Afghanistan is the same as America's relationship with Israel. Having said that, I think there is one major lesson, and that is public support. It was Abraham Lincoln who famously said about public support, with it, nothing can fail, and against it, nothing can succeed. And it was inevitable that at some point the U.S. would pull out their troops from Afghanistan. They weren't going to stay there forever. But one of the reasons it's happened now is because you have a majority of the American population against keeping troops in Afghanistan. You have a recent poll showed around 75% of both Democrats and independents against, and even about 55% of Republicans were against keeping troops in Afghanistan. And I think for Israel, one of the major lessons is how important it is to preserve public support in America for its relationship with Israel. And to that extent, I think one of the most important things that the Israeli government can do is that it should make sure that all the consul generals in America, all across America, and all the people who deal with public diplomacy in the embassy and the various consuls, they should never see the inside of their office for the next 6 months. They should be out every day talking with groups in every congressional district to emphasize what it is that the U.S. benefits from the relationship with Israel and why it's so important to keep supporting it.
But I want to go back to, how people should really be reacting to this, especially in the Middle East, where the uncertainty is palpable. I mean, if you look at Israel, and you're talking about preserving the support for the United States, and how the public support in the United States was very much against the continued presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and that's true. But we're also seeing reports of a large number of intelligence organizations and administration in the United States saying that the way this was done was irresponsible. And so how should Israel be looking at the United States, particularly the Joe Biden administration, with that in mind?
Well, first of all, the way the United States left Afghanistan, unfortunately, it's very analogous to how Israel left southern Lebanon, and somewhat how Israel left the Gaza Strip. I think
we all know the results of the Gaza Strip,
right? And I think it also shows. I think it also shows what would happen if Israel left Judea and Samaria, what it would turn into. So I think another question that has to be asked, even if people are very upset with Joe Biden and the way the withdrawal happened, would it make a difference had the Taliban taken over the country in another 6 months, 9 months, 12 months? I mean, one of the things that's making people, pulling at the heartstrings of people is that they overtook the country, within 2 days. And America had spent $90 billion training an Afghan army.
Well, it probably would have made a difference to the Afghans who are on the ground wanting to get airlifted, wanting to escape, or wanting to somehow maybe ask for help from elsewhere.
That's true. Though I have seen people from the Middle East, not necessarily from the West, saying that many Afghans who didn't want to be in Afghanistan and never wanted to see the Taliban again, had left many years ago. And so it's somewhat unclear. Obviously, there are a lot of people who want to leave Afghanistan, Afghans, but it's a bit unclear who exactly are all these people who are looking to leave.
All right. So again, though, I just want to touch on the effect that this whole incident, this withdrawal, has had on the word of the United States on foreign policy. Right now, Israel is engaged with ceasefire talks with Hamas. They're ongoing on and off negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, and the United States is part and parcel to that. Has their word, has their effect, has their ability to affect change been diluted?
Well, I think you have to go back and remember that President Obama wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but certain conditions on the ground didn't allow for him to do it. President Trump talked about it. President Biden also wanted to get out of Afghanistan. So I think maybe in order to figure out where America is, you have to, again, look back to public support. But on that note, I think for Israel to keep public support from America and preserve it, they have to make sure that in no circumstance are there American soldiers fighting for Israel or providing a barrier between Israel and the Palestinians or keeping the security in Israel, because that will change the structure of public support for Israel in America, and Israel cannot afford for that to happen.
All right, well, we'll have to pay really close attention to this to see how Israel and United States relations and United States foreign policy really is affected by this decision, which I'm sure the effects will be tremendous over the next coming months. Gideon Israel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, moving back to Jerusalem, with the wildfires finally under control, authorities now have the luxury of looking for where to point the blame. And investigators are increasingly convinced that the blaze is of human origins, especially now with United States space agency NASA providing proof. According to satellite imagery that NASA sent over to Israeli Ynet media, the massive wildfires this week were sparked by 3 smaller, unconnected, and decently distanced fires. In fact, the focal point of each blaze was about 4 kilometers or just under 2.5 miles apart from one another. But despite the distances between these seemingly random locations, investigators are increasingly looking towards arson as an explanation. The bigger question until now, rather, has been whether the arson was negligent or deliberate. And now, with NASA's help, conclusions are more strongly swaying towards the latter, especially as the satellite data shows that all 3 fires started simultaneously around 3 p.m. on Sunday. Furthermore, one of the focal points for the start of the fire, around the area of Beit Meir, is full of thick, thorny brush, where regular hikers and tourists are unlikely to pass. That said, no conclusive evidence has yet been presented. Police are hoping to use triangulation tech to see if smartphones were in the area around the time of the fire's beginning. And should authorities find the responsible party or parties, they'll surely have hell to pay. The enormous and deadly wildfire taking over 1,500 firefighters and 20 water-bombing planes over 52 hours to wrestle under control. And by then, nearly 9.5 square miles of land devastated, tens of thousands of animals killed. Moving on, coronavirus cases still rising in Israel amidst the spread of the even more highly infectious Delta variant. Nearly 60,000 active cases now in Israel, with just under 1,000 people hospitalized, 600 of whom are in serious condition. But as far as regulators go, not much has changed. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett rebuking those who are calling for a lockdown and expanding the vaccine campaign instead. In fact, all Israelis over age 12 may soon be eligible for vaccine booster shots. Hannah Rifkin with the report.
With the school year and the high holidays quickly approaching, criticisms of the government's handling of the pandemic seemingly growing, many even calling for preemptive lockdowns. But Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the COVID cabinet still rebuking such talk.
לא כל העולם הוא רק בפריזמה של קורונה, יש פרנסה, יש כלכלה, יש עתיד למדינה. כי בעיניי גם פרנסה וכלכלה זה חיי אדם. אנחנו נעשה הכל כדי שתוכלו להמשיך לפרנס את המשפחות שלכם בכבוד. כדי שמסעדן לא יפשוט רגל. כדי שבעלת מכון כושר לא תיכנס לחובות עד סוף ימיה. כדי שהילדים שלכם לא ייאלצו לדהות 200 ימים מול הזום, כמו שהיה בשנה שעברה.
The cabinet instead then pushing a more complicated solution, learning to live with the disease and simply getting vaxxed every so often.
לכן אנחנו בממשלת ישראל דאגנו להעניק לכל אזרח בגיל המתאים חיסון וחיסון שלישי, כי מדינה מחוסנת היא חלופה לסגר הרסני.
Health authorities even hinting to how third-dose booster shots will soon be made available to all Israelis above age 12, starting in September. In particular, as early vaxxers and the unvaccinated making up the lion's share of serious infections.
זה כבר לא מקום לשתי דעות. זה עולם שאני לא מכיל את הדעות השונות. יש פה מדע, עובדות, והעובדות הן שהחיסונים מצילי חיים.
In fact, of the 105 people killed by the virus last week, 103 had declined to receive their freely offered vaccinations.
ואין תחליף לאחריות אישית. אני לא חושב שהמדינה היא בייביסיטר. המדינה נותנת כלים, אבל למען השם צריך לקחת את הכלים. אנחנו מעמידים חיסון שלישי, כן, צריך לעלות על אוטו, לנסוע ולהתחסן. אל תחכו שמישהו ייקח אתכם, תצאו להתחסן, תעטו מסכות. שני אנשים שעוטים מסכות מורידים את ההידבקות ב-98%. זה הכלי הכי אפקטיבי. זה הכל, חיסונים ומסכות. אם נעשה את זה, חיסונים, מסכות, והייתי מוסיף התנהגות אחראית, לא להתקהל אם לא צריך, אנחנו נוכל להתגבר.
Now, continuing with talk of lockdowns, Prime Minister Bennett speaking plainly on how disastrous such a move would be.
לכן, למרות שסגר, תבינו, הוא הצעד הכי פשוט עבור הממשלה. המון אנשים אומרים, תלחץ על כפתור הסגר, הכל מוכן אגב. לוחצים על הכפתור, התקנה עוברת, הפיצויים זורמים, והכל מסודר, חוץ מדבר אחד, שאנחנו בזה הורסים את עתיד המדינה. הסגר הוא קו ההגנה האחרון רק כאשר כל האפשרויות האחרות מוצאו. הסגרים בשנה שעברה עלו לנו 200 מיליארד שקלים. 200 מיליארד שקלים שהתאדו, וכולנו נצטרך להחזיר את החוב הזה. כל משפחה בישראל נכנסה לחוב של 105,000 שקלים. וזה חיי אדם.
Still, despite the warnings and how sensible Bennett sounds, there are those who argue for a lockdown, particularly because Israel is a mostly vaccinated country. Here to discuss is Professor Cyril Cohen, head of the immunotherapy lab at Bar-Ilan University. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, in a Ynet op-ed by Sever Ploker, I'm going to bring that up, Ploker argues that a lockdown before the September holidays is a, quote, feasible and pretty much inevitable option at this point. Would you agree, or do you think that we could still avoid lockdowns?
I really hope that we can avoid lockdown, and I agree with the Prime Minister, is a terrible thing to do. We already had 3 lockdowns. I'm not sure to what extent it will be efficient, because if you remember, the last lockdown in Israel was not that efficient. The only thing that took us out of that situation was the vaccines, and therefore I do believe that we need to do everything in our power to avoid lockdowns. I'm not talking about, I would say the economy. I'm talking about also psychological and social consequences to such a terrible thing. So we need to do our best to avoid that. And I believe that we still have some margins to do so.
That being said, and again, pointing to not only Sever Ploker's op-ed, but many other critics of the current program, the current COVID regulations, they're saying that the cost to the country in morbidity, in people who are removed from the workforce, either because they're severely ill or die, can be much greater than anything a lockdown might have, and that with a lockdown in place for 2 weeks, we could reduce the morbidity, and with the majority of the population vaccinated, it would be a tremendous result, much better than the result of the previous lockdowns without the vaccinations. Would you agree?
To some extent, you have to understand, to every lockdown, there is an after lockdown. And you only use a lockdown if you already have an exit strategy. And vaccination is a good thing. If, for example, we say, listen, we need to immunize people. Our medical system, healthcare system is under stress. Let's try to have some measures, perhaps a lockdown, so that we can immunize people in this time. I think it's not a bad idea. But just to have a lockdown, for the sake of having a lockdown is not an end by itself. And therefore, I think that before we exhaust any other possibility, we have to exhaust any other possibility before we think about lockdowns.
All right, so let's get to the bottom line. Prime Minister Bennett is basically saying that we have to get to a position, and he's not alone here, we have to get to a position where we live with this virus. What does living with this virus look like, though, when we have to get booster shots every 6 months and the regulations are changing every day?
Yes, so first, you don't know if we're going to have to get a booster shot every 6 months. No one can answer that. That's the first thing, because, we have vaccines for which we give a booster every year, like, for example, a flu, and you have vaccines for which you give only a booster after a few months, and that's all, like hepatitis. So we don't know what the scheme of vaccination should be with these particular vaccines. Second thing, when we talk about living with COVID-19, and that's not what is happening right now, it means that there is a virus, but it is under control. And when I say under control, it doesn't have to be only 10 cases a day. It could be what we have right now, 8,000 cases a day. But we are able to contain that, and it's not going over those numbers. Right now, what we are concerned about is that it's still, growing. I just want to remind you, exactly a month ago, we had only 10 people on the respirators. Today, we have more than 100. So that means that we're not in control. Living with COVID-19 means finding the right balance in terms of, I would say, regulation measures, mask, social distancing, what should we leave open, what should we close, what should we, enforce, etc., and having that pandemic contained.
All right, Professor Seal Cohen, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
And now for some celebratory news. The first Israeli baby to be born in Dubai has finally arrived. And the baby girl, born on Saturday last week, perfectly coinciding with the first anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE. The head of the mission for the Israeli consulate in Dubai, Ilan Stolman, and his wife Jackie welcoming their daughter Maya, who was delivered by an American Muslim doctor at Dubai's Mediclinic Hospital. Maya is the Stolman family's 5th child and the first ever individual to receive an Israeli passport on UAE soil. And Stolman's adding on social media that we are especially delighted by the symbolic timing of her birth, with the head of the mission also noting the outpouring of congratulatory wishes that the family has received from both local and Israeli officials. So on a personal note as well, Mazal Tov and welcome Maya to the world. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Meteorologists calling for clear skies over the next 24 hours. Tonight's lows between 18 through 26 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow, temperatures ranging from 29 through 40 degrees Celsius. And after that, some clouds heading our way this weekend. And now back to the studio with Aaron.
And that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.24 shekels to the American dollar and 2.55 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.